Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So today we're going to be talking about the Amazons, and I've skipped over a bunch of the faction combinations that I just didn't think were really unique enough for these guys that it made me feel like I would want to play them as a separate sort of thing there. And I have played through a lot of them, but we're going to start off by talking about those with a little bit more detail since I didn't do a video on them. So first off, we've got Amazon Harrier. Harrier, as always, is really quite strong just by itself there. It doesn't synergize necessarily with anything better than it synergizes with itself, which is kind of a shame because Harrier is actually quite a lot of fun to play as. It's just that a lot of the Harrier units are really, really powerful in their own right. A lot of the modifications are really powerful in their own right. So I don't need to take anything that Amazon gives me and import it into Harrier. Now, this combination is still going to be a little bit stronger than some of the other ones because being able to take those Amazon economic bonuses to production, to food, to science, and shove that into Harrier is going to give me a much stronger combination. So being able to then have a larger army of Harrier units is going to be pretty meaningful, but it's not so different that I feel like I would want to cover it. The one thing that is a little bit different about this is that you do get a bunch of bonuses to your animal type units there, and because of that, what you can do is you can summon up those really powerful tier 3 animals late game using Clone Predator, and then sort of have your siphoners, because you should have a bunch of those by then, really let that unit shine. So that is something that is a little bit different with the Amazons, but it's not too different from using high tier units from any other faction. The big exception to this is that Amazons are much more likely to get those high tier 3 units through that Clone Predator sort of process as compared to other armies sort of getting maybe a couple high tier units, but you're not going to be seeing them in anywhere near the same kind of numbers as that. The next one is Promethean. Promethean I already went through. This is actually a really, really fun combination. There's lots of synergies here because the Amazons do actually have thermal type weapons as a part of their sort of kit. They're capable of getting lots of weird synergy thanks to things like Earthlink Mask, as well as the area of effect attacks, the longer range on their attacks with visual acuity on their basic units. All of that makes these guys a lot stronger than other sort of types of Promethean. I think that Promethean is sort of turning out to be one of those ones where there's a lot of surprisingly fun combinations that it can do just because its kit's very diverse in terms of what it sort of does. And I think that sort of makes it more interesting to play. And it's not just strong on its own. A lot of the Promethean stuff does synergize with stuff outside of itself. So I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in this particular combination there. Next up, you get Synumbra. I didn't find anything really that unique about the Amazon Synumbra sort of combination here. It does have a slightly unique Malka Invoker, which has got access to sort of dark tendrils instead of the standard. This is capable of locking down an enemy in a position and causing damage over time, as well as causing them to have a mind break. But even with that, this didn't really feel like it was a dramatically different experience from normal sort of Synumbra. I think that as well as I've played more and more of it, Synumbra stuff is just not necessarily the strongest out there. And a lot of the time I feel as though I'm sort of holding myself back by taking the Synumbra stuff instead of just really going hard on the Amazon technology and the Amazon type units there instead. So their Initiate here as well, if we take a look at this here, like we can see the Dark Vine. This theoretically is more powerful than normal. I just haven't found it to be that meaningfully more powerful than the standard Entangle or the standard Devour Hope. So I just think that it's not necessarily an amazing unit to have around. It's just not terrible either. Yeah, it's a mess. I have not much opinion about these guys. So Synthesis, these guys are similar to the way that I play Void Tech with the Amazons. There's no really great unit synergy, although their hacker did get a scan catalog added to them in a recent patch. So they are a little bit better than standard hackers, but even with that, I don't find these guys to be too unique in terms of their units. Now, there is always going to be a lot that you can do with Synthesis. You can apply all the Synthesis mods to your Amazon units and get really interesting and really powerful and unique combinations that way. And also, you can apply a lot of the Amazon things to a lot of the Synthesis type units. In particular, Grounding Harness is really, really good to sort of cross-pollinate there. The big thing about the Amazon Synthesis combination is that the Amazon and Synthesis combo can get ridiculous production and energy credit values, meaning that in the late game, this combination is capable of having like ridiculously huge sort of output of units with mods and stuff like that, and really powerful combinations and stuff. So it's mostly a flood the field kind of strategy, in my opinion, Amazon Synthesis, rather than having any amazing unit synergies that sort of work better for them than any other faction. I still think that Synthesis gets better unit synergies with something like the Vanguard or something like that. Next up is the Void Tech, and this sort of works the same way. I find that you're capable of getting ridiculously huge armies using the Void Tech Amazon combination just because of the high sort of emphasis on production and stuff like that. I do think that this is a strong combination as well. The Echo Walker is a little bit unique, but I don't find it to be that much stronger or that much weaker. It's pretty similar compared to other forms of Echo Walkers in terms of the way they actually perform. Now, there are some nice elements to being able to sort of have it attack for full damage on the first turn, and this means that you don't have to have the grenades applied to them. So I do think that part is a little bit nice there. I also find that the ability to take Quantum Avatar is pretty strong. There's a bunch of heavy units that you're going to get with Amazons, more so than I think other factions, just because you're going to end up with those tier 3 late game critters, as well as, more importantly, the Orion Sentinel is actually a pretty inexpensive large creature that benefits tremendously from Quantum Avatar, so there's a little bit of synergy there as well. But for the most part, Void Tech sort of is mostly there for the economic bonuses, in my opinion. Next up, we've got the Xenoplague. Now, Amazon Xenoplague is one of the few ways that I have found Xenoplague to be fun to play, and that's because you're capable of really putting Amazon mods on a Xenoplague in a way that you're not capable with most other combinations. Not only are you capable of putting a lot of the bioweapon enhancements onto your Xenoplague units, meaning that you can give them weapon enhancements, it's also really nice that a lot of the Amazon things apply to animals, so you can apply those to Xenoplague units. Otherwise, the Xenoplague stuff feels very tacked on and very superficial. This one, it feels a little bit more customizable and a little bit more specialized, and there's a little bit more options going on with this combination that I really appreciate. So I do think that this is one of the most fun ways to play Xenoplague. There are also a few things that the Xenoplague can apply to the Amazons, which is nice, but I don't necessarily find that the Xenoplague mods are my favorite ones to take there. A lot of the time, the Amazon mods are just a little bit stronger than the Xenoplague equivalent, so that is one sort of criticism towards this as well. Next up, you have Celestian. I thought that this one might have been a little bit interesting, but in the end, it played a lot very, very similarly to the way I would normally play Celestian. There's not a ton going on here that's really radically different. The one thing that's a little bit different is their Lightbringer is a bit more spammable. The reason that their Lightbringer is more spammable compared to other versions is that it is a flying unit. And this does create some interesting paradigms where if your opponent is taking all air units and you're stuck taking a bunch of Lightbringers as any other version of Celestian, what happens is your army gets wiped because you can't fire upwards with Lightbringers. By contrast, if you're playing as the Amazons and you're up against an all-air composition, you're going to do fine because your Celestian Lightbringers are capable of attacking other air units because they themselves are an air unit. And conversely, if your opponent has taken a bunch of ground units that are not capable of firing upwards because they've got melee weapons or something like that, or they've got grenades, you can ignore those units and just focus on their few ranged units and then auto clean up the rest of it because they can't fire upwards with the rest of them. So this does provide sort of a slightly different style to it, but at the same time, because they're a melee type unit, they're weaker than just taking a bunch of the Harriers as your sort of air unit, in my opinion. Now, the nice thing about the Lightbringer spam is that they are a Cosmite-free air unit, which is pretty rare, so there is actually still some benefits taking them as your sort of main unit. And that brings us through the whole roster. So let's take a look at a game here, and we'll take a look at, again, the whole sort of roster of things here and take a look at this sort of stuff going on. This was actually from a Celestian game in particular here. So yeah, starting off with the Society tab, we've got access to some pretty powerful abilities. First of all, Ecological Construction. This one is actually really, really good. Your city starts off on a forest, so you are getting that plus 10 for your starting city right away. And it's pretty easy to expand into a forest. It's not an uncommon tile type, but even if you don't have that ability to expand into them that easily or settle them that easily, you are capable of terraforming places into forest tiles, which is usually pretty okay. You want a couple forests around you. just because not only is the production bonus good, but being able to have a settlement around areas that can have production districts. Well, forests are good for production districts, so that helps out in that sort of sense as well. Very, very powerful bonus where you're getting from like 10 to potentially plus 50 production, but realistically you're probably getting from 10 to 30 extra production depending on how you're optimizing your cities. Still, even with that, plus 30 is really, really good. Ecological warfare. This is a powerful buff to your units, giving you just a free damage over time effect to all of your sort of units that are capable of benefiting from that. You've got a lot of units that are going to benefit from that as well. Melee units, as well as anything with biological attacks, fits pretty much your entire early game starting roster of units. The only exception is, once you've got the Shrikes, if you've got your sort of flying scout unit, its laser attack doesn't get that, and the laser ranged attack of your Lancers doesn't get that, but all your other starting unit attacks, every single other one does benefit fully from ecological warfare. It's just a really, really powerful effect, and I think it's one of the ones that you're going to definitely want there. Next up, we have access to Guide and Stewardship for progressive cultivation. This one's pretty okay. Plus 8 base food, so it means that even if you don't have any Arcadian sectors, you're still getting the plus 8, which is pretty nice. It's pretty easy to get an additional plus 8 by making sure that the starting settlement, like the place where your city is on top of, is Forest Arcadian, which would give you a total of plus 16 food. This is not a terrible amount of food that you'd be able to get from this. Now, it's not a ton, and you're probably not going to have a ton of extra Arcadian sectors, but if you do find that you are producing Arcadian sectors for that extra electricity, it can be kind of useful in that sort of sense there, but making this really sort of roll for you, like getting that full, I think you can get a total of 5 plus 8, you can get 48, I think, food from this. Like, you're not going to be doing that. That's not really what it's for there. So it's a slightly smaller sort of bonus than the other ones, but it is still pretty powerful. The only real complaint I have about progressive cultivation is that it comes a bit later than you would want to have access to those food bonuses. It is a nice boost to your later game colonies as well, though. Advanced Wildlife Militarization is really, really powerful. Animal and mounted units gain plus 200 morale, plus 10 health, and gain experience 50% faster. The experience gain is actually really, really meaningful for Amazons because they're capable of getting all of these animals, but those animals are always going to be at rank 1 when you get them. They don't have the sort of benefit of the military research lab to give it a bunch of extra experience points. And since many of them have multiple stages of growth, you definitely want to have advanced wildlife militarization if you're going for any strategy that has animals involved in it, because you're going to end up with so much extra durability for those animals. They're going to have a way harder hitting attack thanks to those extra crits, and having that ability to cycle through their forms faster thanks to the plus 50% experience gain really, really does matter for that type of unit. Next up, you get the Arborean Monitoring Station. This one's actually quite nice, plus 6 research for each forest sector within your domain. By the time you've sort of got access to this, you're probably looking at having like 3 forests per settlement area, and that's just 18 extra science for every sort of one there. And the extra colony range can be a little bit useful, but is probably not the most useful part there. 18 science for a building upgrade, though, is not necessarily gigantic, so I wouldn't get too excited about this, but if you've got a moment to build them, it doesn't take a doctrine slot or anything, it's a building, so if you have a moment where you've got some downtime to build an extra building for that, it does mean you can divert like 3 people out of science and into energy or something like that, which can be pretty meaningful, or you can go through your science even faster if you really want to. And last up, in the Society tab, you have access to New Eden with Bio Crusade, plus 20% damage when fighting mechanical and cyborg units. There's a lot of units in this game that are mechanical or cyborg, and because of this, it's a pretty substantial bonus there. And even if you find you're not fighting those guys, you've got the ability to get your mounted or animal units Frenzy, which is a pretty okay bonus if you're going for a lot of melee attacks. Now, obviously, this is going to be for the best if you're using a lot of animal units with melee attacks and you're up against something with mechanical and cyborg, but having it around is usually not necessarily a bad idea. Just make sure that you're going to get some use out of it because of the composition and stuff like that, and if you are, it's probably going to be quite powerful. The next one is Arboreal Eden. This one's not that powerful. Forest sectors giving you an extra 6 happiness. By the time you've got this, you probably don't need to worry about having extra boosts from those happiness bonuses. But if you really are still stuck in a longer game somehow, this could be something that could help kick your economy into that last little tiny bit needed to win but more realistically, I find that you're more often going to use Bio Crusade to clinch out a victory there. Alright, so let's take a look at the different units here. We don't have all of them unlocked, so we'll just go through this first here. So the Amazon is a pretty decent, okay baseline unit here. Their evasiveness as their sort of prime rank bonus is not necessarily my favorite, but what is nice about these guys is that they do start off with +1 range due to visual acuity. This is to sort of offset the fact that the bio arrows only have 5 range, and even with visual acuity, this puts them at a range of 6, which makes them lower range than other units of their sort. What sort of compensates for this is that they have also got the flash arrow instead of the standard grenade, and the flash arrow is way stronger than standard grenades. Blind as a status effect, as well as being able to stagger units, means that their sort of way of advancing in and staggering enemies is just much stronger than that little bit of damage that you get from the standard grenade type of attack there. What's also nice about these guys is that if you do apply something like, say, the Plague Pustules or the Quantum Grenades or whatever for Void Tech or any of those sort of other weapons, you can have these guys sort of stand behind cover and they'll apply visual acuity to those weapons as well, giving you more range on those types of weapons than you would be able to get otherwise. So visual acuity and flash arrows are sort of what keeps these guys competitive, because their basic attack is a little bit worse than your standard repeating attack. Because of how powerful, though, the flash arrow and visual acuity are, they wind up actually being a unit that I would say is one of the better class of base units in a lot of ways there. Just an all-around pretty decent type of unit there. Biome Answers, this is one of the most overloaded support type units in the game in terms of just early tier support units. Their stats are nothing really that special or anything like that, of course. That's not really what they're there for, but the fact that the scan catalog is really quite powerful. -2 resistance to damage means that you're basically giving your entire army +2 damage against whatever it is you've done this to. Manipulate Mend is a really good heal ability, +25 to health, as well as removing status effects is a pretty nice heal. There are, of course, other heals out there that are just as good at this or better, but having that on a unit like this is pretty good. Manipulate Sleep is a pretty powerful support ability. You just sort of pick a unit that you just don't want in the fight anymore, and being able to sort of keep them out of combat for 2 turns is a really powerful effect if they run out of other support things to do. And the Bioblaster is not a terrible weapon either. It's actually almost as powerful as the bows used by the Huntresses. Its main problem is that it doesn't have visual acuity and that you're going to want to keep these guys further back, but other than that, it's a pretty okay attack sort of ability there. So I think that all in all, the Biome Answer is actually one of the better supports out there. And it's kind of weird that I don't build more of them, but you don't need a ton of them. They're so good that just having 1 or 2 of them is capable of really making a big difference. Next up is the Lancer. Oh, actually, the Scout. Let's take a look at the Shrike here. So the Shrike, as far as Scouts go, is actually pretty good. You're capable of boosting its hit points up there because it is an animal. It's capable of dealing an okay amount of damage with that laser repeater, and you end up with something that's actually pretty comparable in a lot of ways to your standard infantry. It doesn't level up quite as nicely as a lot of them, but it's still pretty good. You can mod this thing up to have some pretty decent stuff there, thanks to the ability to throw on the laser mods and stuff like that, but it does miss out on quite a few mods for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. I would say that this is one of the better combat ones, just because of the sort of way you can decide to throw upgrades into your units as the Amazons here. So Lancer, this is a very powerful unit, and I do think that if you want to go just heavy on Lancers, they work really well. Laser Lance, even though it's not the most powerful ranged attack, does mean that these guys have the ability to throw out some attacks against air type units, and if you're flanking, it is still like a 20 base damage attack there, or a 20 damage attack, which is pretty meaningful. Not as good, obviously, as like dedicated repeating attack long range units against air units, but it's still pretty good. It's still pretty up there. What really makes them special is the fact that they can close into the enemy pretty safely thanks to shields up there. If they can manage to get around the opponent, or if you manage to get behind them, you can throw a distracting shot from like a Biome Answer or something like that to turn the enemy unit around, and then you can hit them with the Laser Lance Strike, and you can get them like 3 times with a huge amount of damage. It's really powerful. That combination of being able to advance fairly safely thanks to that Shields Up mod, the fact that you've got really powerful defensive mods as the Amazons there, you could throw on something like, say, the Spirit Link module for that extra 20% harder to be hit, as well as 2 shields, as well as the extra critical hit damage. Like this by itself makes this unit much tougher. You can throw on the Regenerative Bioregulator or something like that, and you can throw on something like, say, the maybe the grounding harness or something like that, you can end up with a really, really powerful version of this unit that's capable of tanking through and surviving just about anything. I tend to find as well, like, just because of how good these guys are at dealing damage, I don't find that they need to have a ton of offensive modules. Like, the Spirit Link module is pretty much all they need for offense. Just all around really, really good. Next up, you have the Orion Sentinel. This is actually kind of a really interesting unit here. This thing's got almost as good as tank stats, but it doesn't cost any Cosmite, which means that it doesn't have any Cosmite upkeep either. Or just, it's relatively inexpensive for what it is. Now, its performance is a little bit closer to something like a standard infantry or something like that, say a Vanguard trooper or something like that. It's got decent damage, it's got a repeating attack out to 7 range, it's got a sort of area effect grenade-like effect with thorn roots, but it's also got manipulate shield and defensive mode plant roots, which can be upgraded to the improved version. And the thing about this unit is that even with fairly weak mods, like just say crushing roots here, let's say that I've added the regenerative bioregulator to it and I've added the shield of remorse, so this is not actually too expensive a template in terms of what it's costing you to build, but it's capable of tanking its way through a lot of hits there, and it's capable of dealing out an okay amount of damage. So it sort of sits somewhere between a basic troop and a dedicated like tank or something like that in terms of its performance. I actually think that it's a pretty good unit, and because of how durable it can be made and the fact that it can self-heal, it can make a real distraction of itself in the enemy sort of camp there if it sort of pushes up and starts blasting stuff and then really hits up that defensive mode once it gets a bit weakened. You can see your enemy forcing their way through it with a lot of extra firepower that could have really wiped out some of your more dedicated troops, or they leave it alone, it heals up, and then next turn it starts blasting again, and it deals a decent amount of damage thanks to that. It's a really, really good unit, and I think that it's one of the more powerful effects for the Amazons. So next up we have access to, actually I think that's all the ones that I've researched in this particular game. So we have access to the Harrier. Now as far as air-to-air units goes, this is actually a fairly direct one. It's got relatively low defensive stats and stuff like that, but the interception blasters here are pretty good damage, and the laser bombardment is actually a really quite powerful area of effect attack. Not sure why it gives it like the superior overwatch bonus, since every time I superior overwatch I just use the interception blasters, but maybe there's something else that I could do. This is the option that they have for overwatch, which is really, really weird, but I guess there are instances where that could be a useful way of doing things. Now, the fact that this is a flying mounted unit does mean that it has some pretty powerful mods that are available to it, but ultimately this is kind of a fairly expensive unit given the amount of damage that you're getting out of it. So it's going to be one of those situations again where you're paying to go in the air and have the versatility of being an air unit, but you're also paying that extra without necessarily getting more in terms of the offense or defense statistics. Next up, you have access to the Bombardon. I actually like this a lot less than other artillery options in this game. The biocannon is actually very, very high damage though, so that's what makes this kind of a forgivable sort of thing there. The bioshell bombardment is just a really kind of not that strong artillery barrage type ability there, dealing pretty mediocre damage a single time every once in a while because it does have a cooldown. The biocannon is really, really powerful though, so I do think that that's sort of where this thing comes into play, but that's a standard 7-range shot, so it's a little bit weird how this thing's statted up there. So I don't really necessarily think that's a terrible unit, but there are better options. Frankly speaking, if I really want to have that sort of long-range bombard style play with the Amazons instead of a more mobile assault style, I would actually pick Promethean because that gives you really, really powerful options that just really outstrip the Bombardon. Anyway, next up you have the Pteranodon, and this thing is interesting. It's got a very powerful rapid laser cannons with the ability to stagger units. This is a pretty beefy attack there. Tail Swipe is also capable of hitting a bunch of extra units there and dealing a decent amount of damage. So if you can position this correctly, it can deal a lot of good damage there. And then Mighty Roar, I don't find this to be necessarily that useful, but it's something you could potentially use. It's kind of an expensive unit. It's still where I would consider it to be viable, And the reason that it's still viable is that it is, again, a mounted biological type of unit there, so there are things that can apply to it to improve its stats and boost it up with the Amazons. I just don't necessarily think that it's worth paying sort of the high price tag for this type of unit here, because what you're ultimately getting is just like 2 of the Biome Answers in terms of the rapid laser cannon attack there, which is not necessarily great when you sort of think about it like that, because of how much more it costs to get this compared to 2 of those. And those guys are support units, so they're not even attackers. If you had 2 Huntresses, they would actually out-damage this guy by a decent amount and cost way, way, way less. So that's kind of the issue with these top-tier units there. And then you got the Arborean Queen. Now, this one's actually very interesting in terms of what it does as support there. Ridiculously expensive, like way too expensive for me to consider it viable under normal circumstances, but it does have a powerful biocannon, just as powerful as the Bombardon. Hyperpollination, a pretty large area of effect of healing for a fairly decent amount, as well as giving you that hyper focus, making your units more accurate and stuff like that. Very, very powerful support ability. The fact that it's such a huge area is also quite nice in terms of being able to sort of, it's a pretty nice large area effect, makes it so that you can heal more than one thing, whereas most supports only heal the one unit. Regrowth, this means that you're sort of forced into committing to units that are a little bit different than what you would normally expect. Regrowth only raises back plant or animal units. Not necessarily the worst of things there. Does not affect other Arborean Queens, of course. You can't just take a stack of like 6 Arborean Queens and just have a ton of ability to go around in a circle. That would be actually quite strong if you could do that there. But then you get Rootquake, which is really, really weird. It's a 19 hex wide area, which means you're basically hitting everything, which is capable of staggering and entangling units, and you're capable of giving these guys the crushing roots, meaning this is a crushing entangle if you want it to be. I'm not entirely sure like why you would ever need to like entangle everything on the map, but if you really just needed to, the Arborean Queen has got you covered there. I think that this is a unit that is interesting. It's just, again, ridiculously expensive. Even considering that you can get free spawn forests out of this, like I just don't know how to use this unit in a cost-effective way there. So anyhow, let's take a look at their mods and their operations here. So the grounding harness, if you're up against somebody who's using a lot of arc attacks there, and they have to stick with arc, like their main damage dealing units are arc, then grounding harness is of course a great way to gimp them over. And even if that's not the case, then the resistance to stagger is quite often a useful sort of perk that you can add to. Forest Genesis, this gives you the ability to turn a sector into a forest sector. This is actually quite powerful. There's a lot of instances where it's really a good idea to turn areas into forest sectors. So not only for your economy, but for combat bonuses as well. I just think that this is a really, really fantastic operation. Entangling Overgrowth, I haven't found this to be useful on this difficulty. Just the AI's food income is always like unlimited basically, so you're basically paying to apply civil unrest, which is really not that important in this sort of situation. And again, the AI seems to ignore civil unrest as far as I can tell anyway, or they just build the buildings and not have problems with it. Next up, you have Primal Control here for the Primal Awareness Amplifier. This is just your standard detector gear, and it really is dedicated to that role. There's nothing really that special about it. Advanced Instinct Controller, this one's quite nice there. Plus 200 morale and plus 2 resistance to status effects, as well as a shield. For the units that this can apply to, this is actually pretty decent. Plus 2 resistance to status effects. Like, there's tons of status effects in this game. There's like huge amounts of status effects. Being more resistant to those is often really, really powerful. And having plus 200 in morale does mean you can get those early game crits out as well. Regenerative Bioresonance, plus 8 regeneration is actually really, really good. So being able to have that is a fantastic ability. And combine that with the plus 3 bioresistance, that is going to help much more situationally, but it is still a pretty nice bonus there. I think that if I want, the plus 3 bonus to bioresistance, I would still get the regenerative bioregulator instead of the more dedicated unit upgrades for that, just because the regenerative bioregulator is so good. It would have to be like me saying, well, I really want bioresistance, so I'm going to get both. Is how good the regenerative bioregulator is, even if I'm not getting it for its primary intent purpose. Next up, you get access to the crushing roots here. This basically makes it so that your Arborean type units or your plant type units are capable of healing for way more when they're in defensive mode and getting way more armor. It also gives you crushing entanglement with your entangling attacks, but this is really situational for a very small number of units. But it is a really, really powerful mod. This is a way to deal a lot of extra sort of areas of effect damage if you're up against a lot of low tier squishy units that are capable of being entangled. So you're going to be causing like bleed, you're going to be causing entangle, you're going to be causing crushing entangles. They're going to be taking like 14 damage per turn just standing around there. And they can't do anything other than stand around there. So if you're up against the composition where this works against it, crushing roots is really, really powerful. Next up, you have access to the Blood Fury Inducers. I don't find this to be too useful. It depends a little bit. If I'm playing as Amazon and I find the growth, then I'm going to get the Blood Fury Inducers because you can get those guys that summon vines. And if you've got a bunch of those on the field and have everything with Blood Fury Inducers, what you can do is you have those units throw out those vines. Those things count as Arborean, and they get massacred because they're just a cheap summon thing that's supposed to like run out there, melee attack once, and then die. Being able to use those Blood Fury Inducers does mean that those units dying gives me a whole bunch of extra bonuses to my attack, my damage there, plus 30%, as well as a bunch of regeneration, and also this mod gives you a bunch of extra health. So that's a situation I would really say the Blood Fury Inducer is actually really good. Otherwise, it's just, I would rather have other upgrades. Lastly, you've got... you also got access to Clone Predator up here. Clone Predator is able to get you a tier 3 monster or animal. This is really, really powerful. These types of units are usually very strong for their cost, especially since they benefit a lot from those sort of boosts to animals and stuff like that the Amazons have access to. So you're going to get something that's really, really worthwhile out of Clone Predator under normal circumstances, and this is something that if you can support it economically, then spam this out because you're going to get a lot of benefit and mileage out of it. Arcadian Restoration, this is more useful late game because you're going to want more sectors to be energy producing, and this does help you with that as well. So I think that Arcadian Restoration is actually pretty nice, but it's much, much less meaningful than the Reforestation, just because it's coming in a bit later and you don't necessarily need as many tiles set up to Arcadian as you do need them set to Forest. Next up, you have access to the Earthlink Mask. This is actually really strong, 12 strength chance of applying Crushing Entanglement to your attacks there. This is a great way to disable enemies that are shorter range than you, making it so that if you're up against melee and you've got a bunch of units with Earthlink Masks that are capable of hitting the enemy, you can lock down the opponent and force them into a situation where they're basically just standing there getting pelted until they're screwed. Really powerful effect there. Being able to also have your standard units have plant roots improved as a defense mode means that your entire army can get a lot of healing as well as a lot of extra armor, meaning that if something's being focused down or you see a unit about to get swarmed or something like that by whatever isn't crushing entangled, you can have that unit go into defensive mode and it's going to really be a lot tougher than standard defense mode. Lastly, there's the Spirit Link module. This is a pretty decent sort of upgrade for a very small select number of units. So if you do have something that is mounted, you're almost always going to want this. Adds 50% to the critical hit damage, 400 to their morale, making them much more likely to crit, and they become 20% harder to hit. This is a really powerful set of bonuses. They're a little bit all over the place, but it is really, really powerful all in all. So I do think that that's actually a really good mod. We'll talk a little bit as well about their damage types. So biochemical. Biochemical is actually a really powerful weapon tree. The first one on the list here, Acidic Composite, is really, really strong. Permanent sort of melt armor of 1 point is actually really, really good. The only thing that sort of limits this is that you throw a ton of attacks against a unit to try and get its armor shredded. Hopefully it'll be dead before you actually shred its armor too much because, that's the ideal. But if you can't, because it is just that damn tough, then you have to have something like Acidic Composite to get through there. So it is a way to get through the enemy's armor and stuff like that. Volatile Affliction, Infusion Ionic. This makes your weapons deal arc damage. So if you're stuck with a whole ton of these sort of arc weapons and you find yourself up against an enemy that's capable of switching out to have very high damage mitigation against bioweapons, you can switch your damage type out to Infusion Ionic. And the thing that I would worry about is if I was up against Prometheans, they're capable of getting that hazmat suit upgrade for like +4 or +5 to bio resistance. If you're up against something like that, then you have to switch the damage type out from your biochemical weapons. Otherwise, they're going to resist all the damage. So this is a pretty good way of doing that. Next up, you have the Vicious Strain here. Control strength, chance of applying slow. I don't find slow to be a hugely useful status effect usually. Cerebral strain. Unfortunately, this doesn't change the attacks to psionic damage, but catatonic is still a pretty powerful effect there, so this one can be fringe useful. It's hard to find a way to make this one truly useful just because the odds of it happening are pretty low. The fact that this also does more damage against non-mindless means that it is also a tier 2 mod that does plus 30% damage instead of plus 20%. So it is a little bit better that way as well. And then you've got Blight Infection here. This one's not great. There are fringe sort of uses to this, but this is sort of how bio attacks turn themselves into area of effects. It's one of the weakest ways that you could be doing it, because you have to focus enough fire into one unit so that it dies. And then it deals a little bit of damage to all the stuff in a radius around itself. That's not really great. Lastly, we've got access to the Lightbringer. This gives you a massive increase to your resistance to other bio attacks for some reason. And you also have a chance of getting Blighted Plague on units that sort of sit around near you. This is actually quite powerful. Since it can also be applied to units that have claw abilities, it can be used on those sort of melee effects to get Blighted Plague put down on your enemies sort of in large numbers there. And I don't typically use this upgrade just because it's really expensive, but it's not terrible. It's just very, very situational. Like, you'd have to be up against someone who has a lot of bio attacks there for me to really feel justified in using this, but they would also have to be something that has a lot of bio attacks that doesn't have access to the Blightbringer themselves, because if they have Blightbringer themselves, then they can throw this onto themselves and be heavily resistant to the Blighted Plague effect of it. It's a weird one. I don't know. In terms of the laser upgrades, you're going to want stuff like the Incinerator module under those fringe circumstances that you want laser units and you're playing Promethean. Of course, as well, having damage over time is quite nice there. Hard light systems can be useful in a certain situation. I tend not to really think of it as being that great, though. The Searing module, this one can be useful if you find yourself up against way too many shields, but since you have access to a laser weapon that is also a melee weapon, it's a little bit less useful, it's a little bit less necessary compared to other types of factions there, because Amazons do have pretty strong melee options if they really want to. Next up, you have access to the Dazzler system. I actually really like Blind as a status effect. It's useful in a lot of situations, so having the Dazzler system added to your laser weapons is quite good. The Lancer is the unit that benefits least from this because they're in melee combat. So typically speaking, you're going to either be killing ranged units really efficiently, because melee units in range, in the face of ranged units, can generally shred them down, thanks to their sort of reaction attacks and stuff like that. Melee Overwatch rather, and it's just not necessary against enemy melee units all that much. It can be useful in that it will cancel their melee attack. So I would use this more if I was using Arborian Sentinels and stuff like that and wanted to really be annoying, because an Arborian Sentinel using this is basically blinding the enemy into complete uselessness. Laser Precision Module, +1 range. I don't tend to find this as being super necessary for a lot of the units for the Amazons, but if you're going for a longer range strategy, the problem with this is I can't apply this to anyone that's got visual acuity really, so it's a little bit wasted potential there, because that would have let me get some really interesting range values out there. Like if this was applied to the other weapons, the bio weapons, then I could apply it to the Bombardon and have a really long range Bombardon. As it is, it's kind of not my favorite sort of module here. 20% accuracy was pretty nice there, as well as 20% extra damage. It's a pretty okay sort of module. It's just eh. Lastly, of course, is the Plasma Disintegrator. This is not my favorite module. Destroying armor, of course, is pretty nice, but you get that at like tier 1 of the bio tree. And you've got a very small chance of instantly disintegrating a tier 1 or tier 2 unit. It's just such a low chance that you're not going to get it to proc as often as you'd really like to, I tend to find. Although if you just spam it out on like cheap scouts or something like that, you're going to be firing so many shots out that like those really low tier, low value shots that they can get are potentially going to eventually disintegrate some things. So that is our look at the entire tech tree for the Amazons. I do think that this is actually a pretty powerful faction. I think that they've also got some interesting combinations of unexpected things that they can do, and I think that their real emphasis on just that sort of hard economic sort of style, that they're capable of churning out more units more quickly than other factions, really does it's a way of playing the game that a lot of the other factions can't really match up with. Even Vanguard bonuses to that sort of thing are not quite as good as the Amazon ones. So that's our entire look at the faction. I hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time.